Nowadays, it feels like everyone is talking about pronouns, but no one really understands what they are. And that's a real shame, because English pronouns are weird. Like you. Why do we use it in the singular and in the plural? What about the archaic thou? What's the deal with that? And why did we stop using it? And then there's singular they. Is that just a new trend? Or is it actually proper English? English pronouns have quite the surprising history. From a pronoun whose origin is completely unknown, to the phenomenon of neopronouns, which, spoiler alert, might not be as new of a trend as you think. Here is a brief history of English pronouns. To understand how the pronoun system of English got to where it is today, first we have to answer the question, what is a pronoun? After all, it feels like most people don't actually know. Well, the actual technical answer is still a matter of debate among linguists, but the general definition is that a pronoun is any word that stands in for another noun. That's it. Now there are all sorts of different types of pronouns, but typically when we're discussing this topic, we're talking about personal pronouns. These are the types of pronouns that refer to specific people. Me, you, him. So, unlike what some people will have you believe, the Constitution does indeed have pronouns. Literally the first word. Now pronouns come in all shapes and sizes, but English pronouns vary by 4 different categories. First, there's grammatical person. You may remember learning about this in school. First person refers to the speaker, second person refers to the listener, and third person is anyone else. Grammatical person is the difference between we, you, and they. This 3-way distinction is practically ubiquitous across the world's languages. Next, English pronouns can vary by grammatical number. In English, we distinguish our nouns between singular and plural. So grammatical number is the difference between I and we. This distinction is also pretty common across the world's languages, but many languages don't limit themselves to just singular and plural. For example, some languages have dual pronouns, which refer to exactly 2 people, or pockal pronouns, which refer to a few people. And there's even more. Next, English pronouns vary by gender. Now in English, this only happens in the third person singular, he versus she versus it. But theoretically, this could happen with any other pronouns, like the third person plural pronouns in French, or the second person pronouns in Arabic, or some first person pronouns in Japanese. And finally, English pronouns vary by something known as grammatical case. Now this is a pretty complicated topic that we are not going to get into the details of, but generally speaking, case refers to the role a noun plays in a sentence. So the nominative case is for the subject of a sentence, I, he, they. The accusative case is for the object of a sentence, me, him, them. The genitive refers to the possession of something, mine, his, their, etc. There's plenty of other cases out there, but in English, those are the main 3. So, putting all of this together, we can construct a basic table of English personal pronouns, like so. Across the top, we distinguish first, second, and third persons, which are each subdivided by the singular, depending on gender, and plural. Down the side, we distinguish between the cases, like we mentioned earlier. Note, by the way, that English has 2 sets of genitive pronouns, a set used as adjectives and a set used as nouns. Now to clarify, this is just one possible interpretation of the pronouns, which will certainly vary by dialect. For example, many American dialects have started to use the term y'all to refer to the second person plural. The chart also doesn't reflect the fact that many speakers use they in the singular, especially for gender-neutral contexts. We'll talk a lot more about that later. Of course, this chart raises a lot of questions. Why can you be used in both the singular and in the plural, when all the other pronouns have different forms depending on number? And what's the deal with all these asymmetries in the chart? In order to answer those questions, we have to trace the history of English's pronouns, starting all the way back at Old English. Old English is where the written record of the English language started, over 1400 years ago. Of course, people were using pronouns even before writing began, but if we go before the written record, things get pretty speculative pretty quickly. So this is a pretty good place to start. So let's look at the pronouns of Old English, starting with the first person pronouns. Here's the chart. The first thing you might notice is the number distinction. Not only did Old English have singular and plural pronouns, but also dual pronouns for when you wanted to say me and you, or me and someone else. As useful as they seem, unfortunately, dual pronouns didn't last that long in Old English. Next, you may also notice that there's a new case here, the dative case, which was used specifically for indirect objects of verbs. The fact that all the dative forms are identical to the accusative forms is not a coincidence. English was slowly going through the process of merging these 2 cases, which is why we don't have a separate dative case today. The other thing you might notice about this chart is that it's actually pretty similar to modern English. It's pretty easy to see where our modern first-person pronouns come from. I, me, mine, and we, us, our. Of course, they were all pronounced pretty differently. Ich instead of I, ure instead of our. But the ancestry is pretty clear. Unfortunately, you can't say the same about the second person pronouns. Again, we see those dual forms, just like in the first person pronouns, as well as the dative case. Also, as a slight aside, this is the letter thorn. In Old English, it made the th sound, so mentally you can replace it with a th. And while we're talking about spelling conventions, you should also be on the lookout for this symbol, the G with the dot above it. This makes the y sound, so mentally you can replace it with the letter y. Unlike the first person pronouns, the ones in the second person don't resemble our modern pronouns at all. Most obviously seen by the fact that there are separate singular and plural pronouns, which we don't have in standard English. The only one of these that looks at all familiar is ye, which kind of looks like you. But as you'll soon see, Old English ye isn't even the ancestor of you. So some weird stuff is definitely going on in the second person. But if you think that's bad, check out the third person pronouns. Unlike the first and second persons, you'll notice that the third person pronouns don't have dual forms, but they do have a gender distinction, just like modern English. Now take a good look and try to see if you can find any pronouns that resemble modern English. It's not hard to spot a few. He, him, his, and if you look closely, you can probably see where it and her come from. But what about she? What about they, them, and their? Well, the origins of those pronouns are actually a lot more complicated than they might initially seem. Here, let's take a step back and look at all the Old English personal pronouns together. In order to understand what happened, we have to track these pronouns as they evolve over time, into early Middle English. The first thing that happened was the loss of the dual pronouns, which were quick to disappear in late Old English. Then we see a few spelling updates and some vowel changes here and there, but nothing too crazy. And there you go. This is a pronoun chart of early Middle English, which is, well, not that different from Old English, right? So what happened to throw this whole system out of whack? To explain, we have to dig into the history of the English language. Often, we think of a language's history as a very linear affair. We start with Old English, a bunch of changes happen, and we arrive at modern English. But that's a gross oversimplification. Linguistic change is way more complicated than that. The most important thing to remember is that dialects exist. Even during the Old English period, people were speaking quite differently depending on where in Britain they were. So by the time we get to early Middle English, the dialects are all quite distinct. The pronouns I've been showing you thus far are roughly based on the ones that were spoken in and around the London area. Because London ended up being the main cultural hub of the English language, most global varieties of English are based on the London dialect. But that doesn't mean that other dialects didn't play a role. Quite the opposite, actually. As the London dialect developed, many other dialects were changing and innovating in their own right. And it's in those other dialects that so many new pronouns popped up before being borrowed back into the London dialect. So English's pronoun system is an amalgamation of innovation from all across Britain. For a relatively straightforward example, take the pronoun I. Earlier, I showed that in Middle English, this pronoun was ich, but that was only true in the southern parts of England. In the north, they used ik, which had an unstressed variant, e. And that should look familiar because it's the direct ancestor of modern English I. We know that it started in the north because it first shows up in the written record in parts of Scotland, before gradually making its way down south. In fact, up until a few hundred years ago, you could still occasionally hear itch as a first-person pronoun in parts of southwest England, which makes sense. That's the farthest part of the country geographically from Scotland, so of course it took the longest for the new pronoun to get there. For a little bit more intricate of an example, we have to talk about the Vikings. Starting around the 8th century, many Vikings came from Scandinavia to raid, and often settle, parts of the British Isles. Their domain was quite vast, but they mainly settled north and eastern parts of modern-day England, where they would end up having a lasting impact on the English language. The Vikings spoke Old Norse, the ancestor tongue to all the modern Nordic languages. And when they came to England, they brought their language with them. Something like 5% of all English words originally come from Old Norse, including one that you probably use multiple times a day, they. In Old Norse, the word for the third-person plural pronoun was þeir, or sometimes thair. Starting around 1200 CE, the words they and thigh enter the written record in the East Midlands, right at the heart of Nordic influence. Thigh ended up spreading northwards and would end up in the Scots language, whereas they spread southwards, where it would end up in the London dialect, and eventually it would be spread all across England. But this raises a question. Why? Languages are typically pretty hesitant to replace words as fundamental as pronouns, and English already had a perfectly good pronoun in the third person plural. So why did the Old Norse word catch on? Well, let's take a closer look at the Middle English words for he, she, and they, and I'll also add the Old English pronouns for reference. Now this is what I showed you earlier, but remember that this is only one dialect. Let's add all the other dialects as well. Now, things get a good bit more complicated. The only thing that phonetically distinguishes these three words is the vowel quality. Take, for example, The Owl and the Nightingale, a Middle English poem probably authored near Kent. This work uses he to refer to both he and she, and it uses the word he to refer to she, they, and them. Clearly, these vowel changes were causing lots of words to become rather ambiguous. And that is why they was so useful. It was clearly different from all the other pronouns. In case there was ever any confusion from words looking too similar, a speaker could switch to the Norse term to clarify that they were talking about the plural, not the singular. Plus, that's also probably why the other third-person plural forms didn't need to change just yet. Look at that chart of Middle English third-person pronouns again, but now let's look at all the cases. Clearly, there's lots of ambiguity in the nominative, but not as much in the accusative or the genitive. So speakers had good reason to borrow they from Old Norse, but they didn't necessarily need to change their other plural forms. For most of the Middle English period, they was used in the nominative, but speakers kept using the natively English hem or hire, at least in the London dialect. Chaucer, for example, used they, but kept the natively English hem and hir or her. Now, as we all know, by the time we get to modern English, those native H forms have all been replaced with the Nordic TH forms, right? Well, actually, you probably still have a plural H form in your vocabulary. As in I like 'em or I have 'em. This has the same meaning as them, but etymologically, it's believed to stem from the reduced form of the Middle English word hem. So even though most English dialects have switched all of their third-person plural pronouns to the Nordic TH forms, we still have one fossilized remnant that originally comes from English. We already established that in early Middle English, the words for he, she, and they were all incredibly similar, and so speakers had to borrow a new word from Old Norse to clarify that ambiguity. But that only solved the problem in the plural. What about the ambiguity in the masculine and the feminine? These words were also pretty similar. Well, we know that in modern English, we have the word she, so we can rightly presume that at some point, speakers innovated the word she to clarify the gender ambiguity. So, where does the word she come from? That's a great question. Despite being one of the most basic words in the English language, the word she has puzzled experts for centuries because, well, we have no idea where it comes from. There are some promising theories, which I'll discuss in a moment, but all of them have major flaws. The first documented use of anything that looks like the word she was written sometime in the early to mid 12th century, spelled like this, presumably pronounced sha. Soon thereafter, in the written record, we find words like she and sho. Traces of the latter can sometimes be found in modern dialectal speech. Like in parts of Yorkshire, some speakers might say shoe. And traces of the former, well, that's the direct ancestor of modern English she. These new words first appear in the written record in the heart of Nordic influence, so you might assume it was a borrowing from Old Norse. But no, if you look at the Old Norse pronouns, they're not similar to the word she at all. So if not Old Norse, then where does it come from? Well, one theory suggests that it comes from the Old English word seo or siu. This was a determiner in Old English, like the word this or that, but specifically for feminine nouns. Since Old English had grammatical gender, this word used to be used a lot. However, throughout the Middle English period, grammatical gender began to disappear from the English language, so this word fell out of use. The theory goes that this word was repurposed to clarify the gender ambiguity in the third-person pronouns, and it's not too hard to see how that could happen. Some minor vowel alterations and a stress shift, and we could easily get the forms sio and sie, since the sie sound very often becomes a sh sound, kind of like how the old-fashioned issue has become in many dialects issue. It's not hard to see how sio and sie could become sho and she, and eventually she. But the timeline is all wrong here. Old English seo had shifted to theo before the Middle English period had even began. And even then, the word had become obsolete over a century before sha first appears in the written record. It's possible that some other dialect held onto the word just long enough to bring it back into the main language, but that's pretty unlikely, and there's no evidence for it. Another theory, and this one's probably my favorite, is that the word she is actually related to those ambiguous H forms we were talking about earlier. We can imagine a world in which hie and heo stress shift to give us hie and hio. Here, the theory first suggests that the hy sound shifted to a h sound, which is certainly plausible. This happens in some dialects of English today, where the word huge is pronounced huge. But now the theory gets kind of weird. Somehow the h sound is supposed to shift to the sh sound. This is by no means unheard of, but it's not super common. But there is actually some decent evidence in this case. Many Old Norse dialects exhibit exactly this change. So theoretically, when the Vikings came to England, they could have applied their phonetic rules, taking hye and hyo and making them into she and sho. And there's evidence in some of the dialects as well. For example, some Scottish dialects will pronounce words like huge as shuge, and Shetland, as in the islands, was originally spelled like this, presumably pronounced Hjaltland, which supposedly shows the change in pronunciation from h to sh. My favorite example is Shipton, a village in North Yorkshire. Check out how its spelling evolved over the course of hundreds of years. This is supposedly supposed to show that a word starting with the sound he can evolve to hye, and eventually sh. But unfortunately, the timeline is pretty far off here too. According to the Shipton evidence, the sh sound doesn't appear until the 13th century, but we know that forms of the word she appear 200 years earlier, 200 miles away. It's possible that this change was happening independently in other parts of the country hundreds of years earlier, but it's not likely. There's plenty more theories out there, but personally, I think they're all even weaker than the ones I just presented. So the origin of the word she, at least for the time being, remains a mystery. We've now covered a lot of the big changes that were happening throughout the Middle English period. As we enter late Middle English, there's a few more changes we need to discuss. First off, you may recall that the third person neuter pronoun is heat, not it. Well, it's around this time that many English words are starting to lose their initial H. In fact, we still see the remnants of this change in words like honor, air, hour. It's uncertain where this change first happened. It was definitely happening all over the country, but by the time it got to London, it changed heat to eat. Next, remember how Old English had that extra grammatical case that we don't have in modern English, the dative case? Well, throughout the Middle English period, it was on its last legs, and speakers were starting to use the dative in place of the accusative. Shortly thereafter, the two cases merged into one, just like it is in modern English. Now for the next change, let's talk about analogy. In many languages, words with related meanings will often have related forms by association. This makes sense. Speakers may associate certain words with certain ideas if enough words follow the pattern. For example, think about how the letters WH are associated with question words because of words like who, what, when, where, why, and so on. Because there's so many words with a similar form and a similar meaning, we've associated the form and the meaning together. Now, if we look at the Middle English pronouns, we find a strong correspondence in the third person masculine with the letter H. But the other pronouns, well, they don't really have that strong correspondence because the pronouns have changed around so much. So, speakers started using new forms of pronouns to be analogous with the nominative, to associate meaning with form. The words them and their, for example, were borrowed to be analogous with they. These were other borrowings from Old Norse that had existed in some dialects for centuries, but were finally being brought over into the London dialect. Sometimes, though, speakers would innovate new words entirely. For example, in the Middle English pronouns you and ywr, the initial y sound is entirely unetymological, and the y was only tacked on at the beginning to be analogous with the nominative form, ye. Another example is in the word its. The letter s is often associated with the genitive, so speakers took the nominative form, it, and tacked on an s at the end to make the genitive. In fact, this would end up happening with many other words in the genitive. Perhaps the biggest change of this era was the development of two sets of personal pronouns. You know how in English, the word a has two different forms depending on whether it comes before a vowel or before a consonant? Well, in Middle English, the genitive pronouns had the exact same dichotomy. In the same way today that we would say an apple, but a pear, in Middle English you would say min apel, but mi pera, or thin apel, but thi pera. In the same way that we don't think of a and an as two different words, just two different forms of the same word, the same was true of the genitive pronouns in Middle English, many of whom developed a secondary form specifically for use before vowels. However, whenever the pronoun was used as a predicate, that is to say, it was used after the verb, it would always take the long form. So you would say mi pera, but the pera is min, or ywr pera, but the pera is ywris, etc. So the genitive pronouns had two forms when they came before nouns, but they only used the longer form when they were used as predicates. Over time though, the use of the longer form before vowels fell out of favor, and the shorter form when they came before nouns took over entirely. By the time of early modern English, instead of saying mein apple and mei pear, you would say mei apple and mei pear, just as we do in modern English. So now, what was once two different forms of the same word now had completely independent use cases, and thus became two different words entirely. To recap, in short, there was one set of genitive pronouns in Old English, they developed two different forms in Middle English, and eventually each form became a unique word by the time of modern English. But the biggest change that started happening during the Middle English period was in the second person. You see, originally the word thu was used in the singular, and the word ye was used in the plural, exclusively. You could never see you in the singular like you can today. So what happened? We all know that French had a massive influence on the English language, most obviously seen in our vocabulary, where over 30% of English words originally come from French. But French may have influenced our language in other subtler ways too, like in the second person pronouns. You see, in French, there's a distinction between the second person singular, tu, and the second person plural, vous. But sometimes speakers will use the plural form in the singular as a sign of formality. So I might use tu with a friend, but if I was ordering food from a restaurant, I would use vous. In linguistics, we call this a T-V distinction, where the T form is used in familiar contexts, and the V form is used in formal contexts. The words don't have to start with the letters T and V, by the way. It just so happens that many of them do in the Romance languages. So when the French nobility were in charge of England and imposing their language on the English, the theory goes that the T-V distinction was passed on to English too. It would have been expected to refer to nobility with the formal vous in French, and so perhaps some English nobility literally translated vous as a plural, thus using ye as a polite form of address. So let's track the evolution of English second-person pronouns over time. The first documented use of an English V form, the use of a plural in a singular context to mark formality, is dated to sometime in the late 13th century. And these continued to happen as we enter the 1300s, but back then its use was very sporadic. Throughout the early and middle 14th century, the term saw increased use, but was still mostly pretty rare. It was mostly just used by nobility who were trying to make a good first impression, as if they were saying, "Aren't I cultured? I know how to literally translate French." That sort of thing. And at this time, the common folk still weren't really using it that much, unless they were trying to be extra fancy. But this began to change in the early 1400s. Perhaps due to the emergence of an early middle class, there were many people who weren't nobility, but who wanted to distinguish themselves from the plebeians. Since most lower class folk were using exclusively T forms, using V forms may have been a signal of prestige, a way of indicating to others that you were classy and respectful. The use of V forms in this way spread like wildfire, particularly in London and other big cities, where social class differences were very important. More and more people from all walks of life were cluing into the fact that V forms were the hot new thing. And they made you sound like a noble too. By the time we get to about the year 1500, practically all parts of society are using ye in formal speech and vo for informal speech. What's interesting too is that different classes started using these words differently. Remember how tho was associated with lower class and ye with the upper class? Well, this association stuck around, so that people of nobility would consistently refer to anyone in a class beneath them with tho. The words thus began to develop a sense of authority and subservience. Servants, for example, would always respond to tho, but would call back their masters with ye. And parents would talk to their children with tho, but children would have to respond with ye, lest they be punished for speaking uncouthly. As we start progressing through the 1500s, many of these words start to undergo a state of flux. First, recall that originally ye was the nominative form and you was the accusative form. But by this point, for the past couple hundred years or so, the two forms have kind of been used interchangeably. And at this point, you is becoming the default in both nominative and accusative, which is why today we use you for both the subject and the object. But there's also a change in meaning going on. By now, the use of you in the singular is widespread, especially in public, where people are expected to be formal with each other. But it's being used so much that it's coming to be seen as the default singular pronoun. I mean, think about it. Everywhere you go on the street, you're hearing you. It's only behind closed doors or when you're scolding the lower class that you hear thou or thee. It kind of feels like you is the default singular pronoun, and though is reserved for specific personal or authoritative situations. It's around this time that the use of these pronouns becomes extra interesting. Before, there was just one singular second-person pronoun, though, with nothing special about it. But now, there's two different pronouns competing for the same spot. This is demonstrated rather cleanly in the very first scene of Romeo and Juliet. When talking with Samson, Gregory uses you for a single sentence, because the very next words out of his mouth contain though. And there are plenty of other parts of this play just like this, where a character uses one term with someone and then turns around in the very next breath to use the other term. Often though, different terms carried with them different connotations about the speaker. For example, though's association with the lower class meant that it was stereotyped as the speech of the unintelligent. So, in many dramatic comedies of the era, though was reserved for characters who were supposed to be seen as clumsy or foolish. But also, since you was seen as formal, though by contrast was seen as personal and intimate. Lovers, for example, almost exclusively would refer to each other as though to indicate intimacy. One of my favorite examples is actually in another play written around the same time. In it, a character is having a secret affair with his maid. In public, of course, he addresses her as you. But in an aside to the audience, where he assumes that no other character can hear him, he uses an affectionate thee. How romantic. Another difference between the two forms, as mentioned earlier, was respect. But as you was being used more and more, though was being reserved for intentional disrespect. This was most commonly seen in criminal trials, where prosecutors would address defendants with the disrespectful thou or thee, especially if the defendant was being accused of a particularly heinous crime. The best example of this is a famous quote during the trial of Walter Raleigh, who's being tried for treason. Attorney General Sir Edward Coke initially started using the word you. It's a court of law, after all, one should be respectful. But his hatred for Raleigh begins to shine through, as he hurls insult after insult at him, until eventually he shouts, "I thou thee, thou traitor!" That's a little hard to translate literally, but it's kind of like he's saying, "I use thou with you, you traitor!" Coke is saying that he has so little respect for Raleigh, he's resorting to the most insulting of pronouns, thou. But my favorite example demonstrating the uses of thou and you comes from a play written a few years later. The play was called The Miseries of Enforced Marriage, and yes, that is how they spelled enforced. In a particular scene, a knight is talking to his wife when he finds out that she lost all of her money. Try to keep track of what pronouns he uses when. First, he's being affectionate to his wife. Thou art my sweet rogue, my lamb, my pigsney, my playfellow, my pretty anything. Come, bus, prithee. But then he finds out that she's gone broke, and his affection drops. Do you hear, puppet? Do you think you shall not be damned for this? To cozen a gentleman of his opes? To compel yourself into matrimony with a man, whether he will or no with you? And then he gets mad and starts disrespecting her. Witch, ill-faced, stinking breath, crooked nose, worse than the devil, and a plague on thee that ever I saw thee. In the span of a single scene, he goes from an affectionate thou to a dispassionate you, and back to a furious thou. Regardless, beginning in the 17th century, the use of thou began to sharply decline. This probably started in London and radiated outwards. Indeed, if we look at the written record, we find that the last vestiges of thou are in the parts of the country that are the furthest from London. In fact, a certain few dialects still do use thou, especially in parts of Scotland. So why did thou disappear? Well, for starters, you had become the new default term. With everyone using you outside on the street, thou was confined to the home, and it was hard for it to propagate from there. And the fact that the death of thou started in the biggest city in England is almost certainly not a coincidence. Rural speakers were way more likely to use thou, but many rural speakers were starting to move to London at this time. The use of the word thou may have been stereotyped as the speech of those backwards rural folk, whereas the London elite, well, they would use the more distinguished you. So as people from the rural parts of Britain moved to London, they may have tried to compensate for this by using the word you more and more to try to fit in with the city folk. Another motivating factor may have been religion. In the mid-17th century, Quakerism emerged and rapidly grew. As a part of the movement, the Quakers wanted to refer to everyone equally, regardless of class, and so they opted to use the words thou and thee in the singular exclusively. As a result, these forms may have been heavily associated with religion, especially religious fanaticism. By the time we reach the end of the 17th century, the word you is practically ubiquitous in the singular, at least in London, and you can probably see why. The word thou had become associated with too many negative stereotypes that Londoners wanted to avoid. If you used thou, you sounded foolish, or disrespectful, or low class, or rural, or fanatical. And so its use continued to decline. By the year 1700, it was widely recognized as non-standard. And, aside from religious or historical texts, it practically disappears from the written record by 1850. And that's how we got to where we are now, where thou is practically unheard of in most dialects, unless you're reading old literature. It's kind of funny. In a way, the word has spun around to mean the exact opposite of what it used to mean. Because we tend to treat archaic speech, like that of Shakespeare, as fancier, thou now carries a totally different connotation. Compare how are you with how art thou. The second one sounds fancier because it uses archaic language, which is kind of ironic, because a few hundred years ago, it would have been the other way around. You was the fancy version of thou. And with that, we've arrived at the canonical modern English pronouns. When you compare this list with the Old English list, it's kind of incredible just how much has changed. We lost an entire grammatical number and combined the second person singular and plural. We merged two grammatical cases into one and split the genitive into two. We made a bunch of irregular tweaks here and there, added a mystery word, and borrowed a whole set of pronouns from a different language. When you study historical linguistics, they often tell you that pronouns are one of those features of languages that are really resistant to change. That's certainly true for a number of different languages, but English flagrantly bucks that trend. Awesome. But we're not done yet. In the modern day, there's a lot of discussion about how these pronouns are continuing to change, but how new are these changes really? For example, singular they. A lot of people nowadays are using they not just in the plural, but also in a gender-neutral singular sense. Like if I said, if someone needs help, they can ask me. The word they is referring to a singular referent, someone. And we can use other third-person plurals in the same way. Here's their number, call them back, etc. It's especially useful if you don't know the gender of the described person, and as such, it's seeing more and more use every day. It certainly feels like a new trend, but here's the truth. Singular they is not a recent innovation. This has been a feature of English for, get this, 700 years. The earliest use of singular they in the written record traces back to the early 14th century. That's only about 150 years after plural they first entered the English language. So for the vast majority of time that English has had the word they, it's been used for both the plural and the singular. And it wasn't rare either. Chaucer used it, Shakespeare used it, Twain used it. It was even in the King James Bible. So why do people push back against singular they so hard? Well, everything was fine up until a few hundred years ago. You see, grammarians back then were trying to codify a rigid set of grammatical rules for English. But instead of being descriptive, describing the way language is actually used, they were being prescriptive, prescribing the way language ought to be used, even if no one actually speaks that way. One of the rules they came up with was that singular they was ungrammatical, because you can't use a plural word to refer to a singular referent. Except we already do that with singular you. That's a plural word being used to refer to a singular referent. Yeah, they clearly didn't think this through. It didn't really matter though, because the rule stuck and was perpetuated for centuries, even today. But now thankfully the tide is turning, and singular they is being accepted into the mainstream. The average person doesn't think twice when they hear it. I bet you didn't even notice that I just used it in the previous sentence. But still, people protest against singular they, largely because of those unfounded grammatical rules from hundreds of years ago. There have been other proposals. For example, you may have heard that some people prefer he or she, which personally I find that a little clunky. For a while, there was also the strategy of generic he, where the pronoun he could also be used for gender-neutral contexts. However, this practice was rife with sexism. Not just the idea that men are somehow the default, which is bad enough on its own, but there's multiple recorded instances of women being discriminated against because a statute or law used a generic he, which was deliberately misinterpreted as a masculine he. So historically, a lot of people were trying to find out new ways they could refer to a gender-neutral third-person singular. They didn't want to use singular they because they were being taught that was wrong, and they didn't want to use generic he because that was sexist. Many called for the creation of new pronouns, or neopronouns. This is the origin of neopronouns, at least in English. It's not some recent phenomenon, it's been happening for hundreds of years. In a piece discussing the shortcomings of the English pronoun system, Scottish economist James Anderson first proposed the use of oo as a gender-neutral third-person singular pronoun. This is one of the first documented instances of someone calling for the use of a neopronoun, and it happened in 1792. I bet you had no idea that neopronouns were that old. And plenty of people followed in his footsteps. In 1841, we got the proposal of e, em, and es. And in 1858, we got thon, or thun, a contraction of the one. This one probably got the closest that any neopronoun has ever got to hitting the mainstream. It saw a decent amount of use in the late 1800s, and it's one of the only neopronouns to be cited in a number of different dictionaries. The most interesting one, in my opinion, is probably z. This is one of, if not the most common neopronoun today, and so I feel like a lot of people accordingly think it's a recent innovation. Not so. It was first proposed in 1864. The neopronoun z is over 160 years old. I could cite examples like this all day. All the neopronouns you see on your screen right now are over 100 years old. But as we all know, none of these neopronouns have really caught on with the mainstream. Not yet, anyway. And that makes sense. It's really hard to force language change. Languages evolve over time, on their own, naturally. In a sense, they was the original neopronoun. A new gender-neutral pronoun that wasn't native to English. But no one intentionally borrowed this word from Old Norse. Instead, it just naturally evolved into English through language contact. That's the key behind linguistic change. It almost always happens naturally. That's why most new pronouns haven't been intentional coinages, but natural evolutions. And why most speakers feel a lot more comfortable with singular they than they do with z or thon. Or take the word y'all, for example. This is perhaps the most well-known of English's new pronouns, probably originating in the American South as a contraction of you all. But no one intentionally coined the word. Instead, speakers naturally developed it out of a need to differentiate between the second person singular and the second person plural. And plenty of dialects today are making new pronouns. Whether or not these count as neopronouns is unclear. There isn't a super rigid definition for the term. But English dialects all over the world are naturally developing new pronouns to fill in the gaps in our current pronoun paradigm. For example, in the mid-2000s, linguists reported that school children in Baltimore had innovated a new gender-neutral third-person pronoun, yo. You could say something like yo through something to mean he or she through something, or they, singular, through something. And nowadays, this is a core staple of Baltimore African-American English in younger speakers. So English has had quite the linguistic history when it comes to pronouns, and a big part of that was dialects. As discussed previously, it was the many dialects of Middle English that historically innovated so many of English's pronouns. But now that English is the most widely spoken language across the globe, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of English dialects. If I had to guess, I'd say we're about to enter an English pronominal renaissance. Just as the Middle English dialects innovated new forms to combat ambiguity and serve certain social roles, modern English dialects have the perfect opportunity to do the exact same thing in the modern day. And there's already dozens of modern examples across the Anglosphere, documented by linguists. Sometimes to clarify the ambiguity in the second person, sometimes to introduce a gender-neutral third-person singular, and sometimes new innovations entirely, like dual pronouns, or inclusive versus exclusive pronouns. English pronouns have changed so much already. Who's to say what more is to come? So that was a brief history of English pronouns. Emphasis on the brief, though, because there's infinitely more to talk about when it comes to this topic. So if you want to learn more, I implore you to check out these sources, which I put all in the description, and I've also put some other YouTube videos or further reading material in case you're curious. If you notice that I got something wrong in the video, please let me know, and I'll put any corrections in a pinned comment or in the description. And most importantly, thank you for watching. Witch, ill-faced, sinking breath, crooked nose, worse than the devil, and a plague on thee that ever I saw thee. What the hell is this video?